Chapter 1, A Sudden Summons. It was 8:55 a.m. when Cecilia glanced at her wristwatch for the third time in the past 5 minutes. Only 5 more minutes until the clock would strike 9, and as always, she was determined not to be late. In 15 years of working at the same company, punctuality had become part of her identity. She took pride in being the first to arrive every morning, always eager to get to work and make progress. Her reputation for reliability and consistency had earned her the trust of her colleagues and bosses. Today, however, something felt different. As she hurried through the bustling downtown streets, her thoughts drifted to the path her life had taken. At 50, Cecilia was not rich, nor was she famous, but she had something far more valuable in her eyes: integrity. She had never been tempted by shortcuts or quick wins, always striving to be honest in both her professional and personal life. She reflected on moments when that integrity had been tested, like the time she found a wallet full of cash on the street. Her friends had laughed at her when she returned it to its rightful owner, calling her foolish. They couldn't understand why she hadn't just kept the money. But Cecilia knew she would never be able to live with the guilt if she had done otherwise. "Morning, Mr. Jorge." Cecilia greeted the doorman as she walked past the entrance of her office building. She smiled warmly, knowing he would always be there with a friendly greeting. "Good morning, Miss Cecilia," the doorman replied with a smile. "I trust you're doing well? Always so punctual." "As always, Mr. Jorge. Have a great day." She didn't mind the small talk. It was these small gestures, these quiet moments, that added a sense of comfort to her routine. They made the hectic pace of the day feel manageable. The elevator ride was short, but she managed to exchange pleasantries with a colleague, Mari, who was standing next to her. "Ready for another day of numbers and reports, Cecilia?" Mari asked, flashing a grin. "You know it," Cecilia replied, nodding with enthusiasm. "I love what I do. It keeps my mind sharp." Mari laughed lightly. "I don't know how you do it. All those numbers. I'd go crazy. I just like the order of it all. Everything has its place," Cecilia said, smiling to herself as the elevator doors opened. Arriving at her desk, Cecilia set her bag down and booted up her computer. She quickly reviewed the tasks for the day. She was meticulous about her work, everyone in the office knew that. Her reports were always precise, and she prided herself on catching even the smallest discrepancies. Her colleagues often joked that if a penny went missing from the company's finances, Cecilia would find it. She wasn't bothered by the joke; in fact, it was a badge of honor. But today, something felt off. As she started to organize her day, her gaze kept flicking to Jason's office. Jason, the department head, was pacing back and forth inside. Normally, he was calm and collected, but today he seemed restless. Every so often, he would glance in Cecilia's direction, his face tight with tension. She couldn't help but wonder why. Jason was not someone who typically took an interest in her work. In fact, their interactions were usually limited to him criticizing her rigid adherence to rules. She often wondered if he resented her for following procedures so closely. At 10:50 a.m., just as Cecilia was settling into her work, Jason walked up to her desk. His face was as neutral as always, but today, there was something different about the way he carried himself. His movements were slower, more deliberate, and his voice sounded oddly careful. "Cecilia, I need to speak with you. Can you come to my office in 10 minutes? Jason asked, his tone soft but insistent. "Of course, sir. I'll be right there," she responded, surprised but not alarmed. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched him turn and walk away. What did Jason want? It was rare for him to request a meeting with her, let alone for something to be so pressing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As she stood up and gathered her things, ready to head to his office, a hand suddenly gripped her arm. It was Carlos, a colleague from the finance team. His usual easygoing demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of urgency that was hard to ignore. "Cecilia, wait," Carlos said, his voice low and serious. "I need to talk to you for a second. It's important. You have to leave this meeting. Quickly." She looked at him, bewildered. "Carlos, what are you talking about? I have to meet with Jason. He asked for me specifically." His eyes darted around, as though he were checking if anyone was listening. "Listen to me, you don't want to be in that room. Jason. He's going to try to get you to do something you won't like. Something that could cost you everything." "What do you mean? What's going on?" Cecilia asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Just trust me. Get out of that meeting as fast as you can. Please." Before Carlos could say more, Jason appeared in the hallway, his voice calling her name. "Cecilia, are you ready? Let's start the meeting." I have to go, Cecilia said quickly, turning towards Jason as her heart began to race. She gave Carlos one last look, but he had already stepped away, disappearing into the crowd of employees. With a deep breath, Cecilia followed Jason down the hallway, her mind swirling with confusion and unease. She tried to shake off the feeling in the pit of her stomach as she entered his office, but the tension in the air was thick. As soon as she stepped inside, Jason greeted her with an overly cordial smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Please, Cecilia, have a seat. Can I offer you some coffee?" Jason asked, his tone unnaturally warm. "Thank you, sir," Cecilia replied, her voice polite but distant. She took a seat, still unsure of what was coming next. The conversation began with pleasantries, Jason commenting on her punctuality, her dedication, and the excellent work she had done over the years. But as he spoke, Cecilia couldn't shake the feeling that he was stalling, as if waiting for the right moment to drop a bombshell. Finally, Jason leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "Cecilia, I need your help with something. A delicate matter that requires discretion." He pulled out a folder from his drawer and placed it in front of her. "There are some adjustments that need to be made to our financial reports. Nothing serious, just a few numbers that need to be relocated. I trust you'll understand." "What do you mean by adjustments?" Cecilia asked carefully, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. She already knew where this was headed, but she wanted to hear it from him. "Oh, nothing illegal, of course," Jason said, his smile returning but not reaching his eyes. "Just some changes to ensure the numbers look better for the board meeting next week. In return, I can guarantee you a significant raise in your salary, even a promotion." Her breath caught in her throat. She had heard rumors of such things happening in the company before, but she never thought it would come to her. Fraud. That was what he was asking her to do. With a clear voice, she looked him directly in the eyes and replied, "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't do that. I won't falsify any reports or participate in any illegal activities." Jason's smile faltered, his eyes darkening with barely concealed frustration. "Cecilia," he began slowly, "you don't understand the opportunity I'm offering you. Think about it. This could be your chance to finally get ahead. To be recognized for all your hard work." Cecilia stood up, her voice firm and resolute. "I fully understand what you're asking, sir, and my answer remains no. I've spent years building my reputation on integrity, and I won't compromise it for anything, especially not for money or a promotion." Jason's expression darkened further, but Cecilia stood her ground. With a final look at him, she walked out of the office, heart racing, but with a sense of conviction that she had made the right choice. Chapter 2, A Desperate Proposal. Cecilia had barely returned to her desk when her mind started racing. The conversation with Jason had shaken her more than she'd anticipated. She had walked out of his office with her head held high, her refusal clear and firm, but inside, her thoughts churned. What would happen now? Would Jason retaliate? She couldn't help but wonder if he would make good on his implied threats. But more than that, she was troubled by the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ringing of her phone. It was Carlos. "Cecilia, you've got to be careful," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I know," Cecilia replied, not even bothering with pleasantries. "I just had the meeting with Jason. He's asking me to." "I know," Carlos interrupted. "That's why you've got to stay on your guard. He's not the type of person who forgets these things easily. If he doesn't get what he wants from you, he'll make your life hell." "I know," Cecilia muttered again, glancing nervously around her cubicle. She didn't want anyone overhearing this conversation, especially in a place as small as the finance department. The walls had ears here. "Cecilia," Carlos continued, his voice lowering even further, "you don't understand. What he's offering you isn't just a bribe, it's an ultimatum. If you refuse him, it's going to get ugly. He'll make sure you're punished for not playing along. He's dangerous that way." "I didn't take his offer, Carlos. I can't. It's just not who I am." The words came out with more confidence than Cecilia actually felt, but she stood by them. Integrity mattered to her more than any promotion or financial reward. "But you've got to be ready for what's coming next," Carlos pressed. "You don't know Jason. He's not the kind of guy who forgets things, and he won't let you walk away unscathed. I'm telling you, if you don't leave now, you're going to regret it." "I can't just leave, Carlos," Cecilia responded, the sense of determination that had fueled her refusal to participate in fraud surfacing again. "I've been here for 15 years. This is my career. I'm not going to let anyone take that away from me." "You don't understand," Carlos whispered, urgency creeping into his voice. It's not just your career that's at stake. It's everything you've worked for. He'll ruin you. Believe me, Cecilia. Just think about it. Don't let pride get in the way of your safety. She had no intention of letting Carlos' words get to her, but there was no denying that he was speaking with a certain conviction. He had always been a good colleague, but now he was talking as though he knew more than he was letting on. I'll be fine, Carlos, she said finally, her voice firm. Thanks for the warning, but I made my decision. I can't compromise my values for anything. Her response was met with a long pause. Then, just before hanging up, Carlos added one final warning. Please be careful. Jason won't let this go. I wish I could do more for you, but all I can do is tell you the truth. With that, the line went dead. Sighing deeply, Cecilia placed her phone back on her desk. She was shaken, but she was also resolute. She had always known that her integrity could cost her, perhaps this was the moment it would do just that. But at least she could hold her head high, knowing she had done the right thing. The rest of the day passed in a blur of reports, phone calls, and the occasional glance toward Jason's office. He hadn't called for her again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. The sense of unease she'd felt earlier lingered, and every time their eyes met, she could see the tension in his face. He wasn't happy with her refusal, and it seemed like he was quietly stewing over it. It was nearing the end of the day when Jason finally appeared at her desk. She had been expecting this moment, but now that it was happening, her heart pounded in her chest. Cecilia, Jason said in a calm, almost pleasant voice. I hope I didn't catch you at a bad time. I wanted to discuss something with you. There was something in his tone that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't anger, but something far more calculating. Jason wasn't done with her yet. Of course, sir, Cecilia replied, standing up and meeting his eyes. I'm always available. Jason smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm glad to hear that. Cecilia, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, and I think perhaps you misunderstood me. I'm sorry, sir, I don't think I misunderstood, Cecilia said, her voice steady but calm. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. No, Cecilia, Jason interjected, his voice growing smoother. You see, I'm not asking you to break any laws or do anything that would harm the company. All I'm asking is for you to make a small adjustment, one that will benefit everyone. In fact, I'm sure you'll agree once you think it through. The financial reports need a slight tweak, and in exchange, I'm offering you the kind of recognition you've worked so hard for. I've already made myself clear, sir. I can't do it, Cecilia replied, her resolve unwavering. I won't sacrifice my principles for any position or financial reward. That's just not who I am. For a moment, there was a silence between them, and Cecilia thought she saw something dangerous flicker in Jason's eyes. It was as if the carefully controlled mask of politeness he had been wearing was beginning to crack, just a little. Very well, Jason said at last, his voice colder now. But understand this, Cecilia. You've made your decision, and I've made mine. And I won't forget this. With that, Jason turned and walked away, leaving Cecilia standing there, feeling as though a storm was brewing just out of sight. As the workday ended and Cecilia packed her things, she felt the weight of his words settle heavily on her shoulders. She didn't know what would come next, but one thing was clear, Jason wasn't finished with her. The uncertainty hung in the air, thick with the promise of an impending confrontation. Cecilia walked out of the building with her head held high, but her mind was clouded with doubt. She had stood firm, but the future still loomed uncertain, and she couldn't help but wonder if this was only the beginning. Chapter 3, The Price of Integrity. The next few days felt like a storm that was gathering speed, one that Cecilia knew she couldn't avoid, no matter how much she wanted to. After her refusal to go along with Jason's proposal, the atmosphere at work had shifted. The subtle tension she had felt in the air now hung like a thick fog, and she could sense the growing pressure from all sides. At first, Jason said little. His demeanor remained polite, but distant. However, the underlying hostility was unmistakable. He no longer offered casual greetings in the hallways or acknowledged her work in the same way. Instead, it was the cold silence of someone who was silently marking you for failure. He had shifted gears. Cecilia could feel the weight of his disapproval pressing down on her with every passing day. At the office, everything seemed to be business as usual, but Cecilia noticed the subtle shifts in how she was treated. The usually bustling finance department had grown quieter. Her colleagues, once friendly and collaborative, now avoided eye contact with her, offering nothing more than a polite nod when they passed by. She could feel their discomfort, and in some cases, their fear. There were whispered conversations behind closed doors, fleeting glances when she entered the break room, and a general sense that they were avoiding her. She knew why. No one wanted to become collateral damage in Jason's inevitable retaliation. By the end of the week, Cecilia could no longer ignore the changes. Her inbox was flooded with requests that were increasingly unrealistic. Tasks that would take weeks to complete were being handed to her with strict deadlines that were impossible to meet. She was given piles of reports that had to be revised and corrected immediately, as if Jason were deliberately setting her up for failure. Every new task seemed to demand more of her time, more of her energy, and she knew that the more she worked, the more Jason would push. One afternoon, as Cecilia sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over her keyboard, she received an email from Jason. The subject line read, "Immediate attention required." It was a request for a full analysis of the department's financial projections, and he wanted it done by the end of the day. Cecilia stared at the email for a moment, her mind racing. She had just completed the last round of projections, and there was no way to turn around such a detailed report in such a short time. This was the sort of task that would require days of meticulous work, not a few hours. Her first instinct was to respond to the email and request more time. But she knew that would be met with resistance. Jason had already made it clear that he didn't care for excuses. No, she would have to do it. But as she sat there, staring at the screen, a gnawing feeling of dread began to settle in her stomach. The deeper she was buried in impossible work, the less time she had to notice what was going on around her. She couldn't help but feel that Jason was using this work as a way to punish her. As she dived into the task, Cecilia couldn't help but think about the pressure she was under. She had made her decision to stand by her integrity, but the cost was now becoming painfully clear. She had spent 15 years building her career, and now it felt as though Jason was intent on destroying everything she had worked for. The constant barrage of impossible tasks, the increasing isolation from her colleagues, and the quiet hostility, it was all taking its toll on her. It wasn't just about the workload anymore, it was about the loneliness. Every time Cecilia glanced around the office, she could feel the unspoken tension in the air. No one spoke to her unless they absolutely had to. No one asked her for help or guidance. The subtle whispers behind her back grew louder, and she had to wonder, was this the price of integrity? By the time 6 p.m. rolled around, Cecilia was exhausted. The report was finished, but she knew it wasn't up to her usual standards. She had been rushed, forced to cut corners just to meet the deadline. It wasn't that she didn't care about the quality of her work, it was that she had been put in a position where doing the job right was no longer an option. She was forced to rush, to make mistakes, and to deliver subpar work. She left the office that night feeling hollow. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Cecilia tried to shake off the heavy weight pressing on her chest. She had done the right thing, she had refused Jason's unethical proposal, but the consequences were beginning to feel unbearable. Would it be worth it? Was her integrity really enough to justify the suffering she was enduring? The next morning, the consequences of her refusal became even clearer. Jason walked into the office in the usual manner, but his eyes were different, colder, more distant. He didn't say a word to Cecilia as he passed her desk, and the icy silence was even more noticeable than the usual professional distance. She didn't need him to say anything. His expression said everything. It was 10:30 a.m. when Cecilia received another email. This one was more direct. "Please come to my office, Cecilia." The subject line was cold and to the point. There was no greeting. No pleasantries. Her heart sank as she read the email. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing for sure. It was not going to be good. As she walked to Jason's office, she felt a sense of dread settle over her. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway, and she couldn't help but notice the way her colleagues looked at her as she passed. The avoidance was more pronounced today. There was a certain sympathy in their eyes, but Cecilia wasn't sure she could bear their pity. When she entered Jason's office, the tension in the room was palpable. Jason was standing by his desk, flipping through a pile of papers, and when he saw Cecilia, his face hardened. "Cecilia," he began, his voice sharp. "I've reviewed your report. It's not up to standard. You were given a clear deadline, and you failed to meet it." "I did the best I could, sir," Cecilia replied, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "I had limited time, and I had to work with the data that I had." "The data isn't the problem," Jason snapped, his tone now laced with annoyance. "You're the problem, Cecilia. You've been dragging your feet, and frankly, I'm tired of it. I've given you chances to improve, but it seems like you're more interested in playing by your own rules than in doing your job properly." "I've always done my job to the best of my ability, sir," Cecilia replied, her voice unwavering despite the tension rising between them. "And I won't compromise my integrity, no matter how difficult the situation becomes." "That's your problem," Jason said with a dismissive wave. Your integrity doesn't matter to me. All that matters is results. And right now, you're failing. The word stung, but Cecilia stood firm. This was the price she was paying for doing what was right. The weight of the situation was heavy, but she would carry it with dignity. She wasn't going to back down, no matter how hard it became. Chapter 4, Uncovering the Truth. The following days were the most grueling Cecilia had ever experienced. Her workload continued to pile up, and with every passing hour, the feeling of being trapped in a never-ending cycle of frustration deepened. The impossible deadlines. The critical remarks. The isolation. She was surrounded by whispers and looks of pity, but no one dared to intervene. Cecilia was now an outcast in her own workplace. She had reached the point where she could barely keep her head above water. Every report she touched felt like a mistake waiting to happen. The constant pressure to fix errors, the extra tasks heaped on her desk, and the long hours in the office were starting to take their toll. Cecilia couldn't remember the last time she had gotten a full night of sleep, and her nerves were beginning to fray. One particularly late evening, as Cecilia worked through yet another set of financial projections, she noticed something strange. A discrepancy. At first, she thought it was just another mistake, another issue caused by the constant rush. But as she dug deeper, the numbers seemed off in a way that didn't make sense. There was a pattern to the errors that felt deliberate. This wasn't just sloppy accounting. Something more serious was at play. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? She knew she had to take a closer look. She pulled out the previous set of reports, comparing them with the new data. The more she examined the documents, the clearer it became. The numbers weren't just wrong. They were manipulated. Jason had been telling her to adjust reports, but this wasn't an innocent tweak. This was outright manipulation, a pattern of intentional falsification designed to hide large sums of money. As she stared at the documents, a wave of disbelief washed over her. The figures weren't just wrong by a small margin, they were systematically altered. And now, as she reviewed more files, she realized this wasn't the first time. There were several instances over the past few months where the company's finances had been smoothed out, numbers had been shifted to make the company's performance appear better than it actually was. Jason had involved her in a fraudulent scheme, but this went deeper than she had ever imagined. The embezzlement was more than just a few tweaks here and there. It was a calculated effort to mislead investors and auditors. The stakes were much higher than Cecilia had thought. Her hands trembled as she reviewed the data again. The evidence was right there in front of her, staring back at her from the spreadsheets. She knew that if she went public with this, everything could change. The company's reputation would be shattered, and Jason, and likely others in the upper ranks, would be exposed, but Cecilia was no longer afraid of the consequences. She had always prided herself on doing the right thing, no matter the cost. And this time, she knew exactly what she had to do. After hours of reviewing the files and gathering the evidence, she sat back in her chair, exhausted. There was no turning back. She had the proof she needed. The truth was undeniable, and it had to be brought to light. She wasn't going to let Jason, or anyone else, destroy everything she had worked for. But even as she prepared to take action, a wave of doubt began to creep into her mind. What if it all backfired? What if exposing the truth cost her everything? Her career, her reputation, her livelihood. She had always been a person of principle, but could one person really make a difference? The night dragged on, and by the time Cecilia made up her mind, it was nearly 2 a.m. She couldn't wait any longer. The following day, she scheduled a meeting with the company's director, someone she trusted far more than Jason. She didn't want to make accusations without the proper evidence, but she knew that she had to act fast. The longer this went unchecked, the more damage would be done. The next morning, Cecilia woke up early, her stomach in knots. As she walked into the office, the weight of the decision she had made settled heavily on her shoulders. She felt the eyes of her colleagues follow her, and the whispers, though quiet, were still there. She kept her head down, focusing on the task at hand. At 10 a.m., Cecilia entered the director's office, her folder of evidence clutched tightly in her hands. The director, Mr. Edwards, was a no-nonsense kind of person. He was known for his integrity and professionalism, and Cecilia had always respected him. Now, she hoped that he would prove to be the ally she needed. "Good morning, Cecilia," Mr. Edwards greeted her, offering her a seat. "What can I do for you?" "Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Edwards," Cecilia began, trying to steady her nerves. "I have something serious to discuss. Something that concerns the financial integrity of the company." She opened the folder, laying out the evidence she had gathered. Mr. Edwards took the papers from her, his expression unreadable as he scanned the documents. "What is all of this, Cecilia?" He asked quietly. These are financial discrepancies. Major ones. And I believe they are part of a larger scheme to falsify our reports, she explained. I have reason to believe that Jason, and possibly others, have been manipulating the books for months. For a moment, there was silence in the room. Mr. Edwards continued to study the evidence, his brow furrowing as he pieced together the information. Finally, he looked up, his face serious. This is incredibly troubling, Cecilia. But I appreciate your honesty in bringing this forward. We will take immediate action. I'll initiate an internal investigation and bring in external auditors to verify this information. The relief that washed over Cecilia was almost overwhelming. She had done the right thing. She had exposed the truth, no matter the cost. As she left Mr. Edwards' office, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. Part of her felt vindicated, knowing that she had done the right thing. But another part of her was filled with dread. What would happen next? Would her career survive this? And what about Jason? The investigation would take time, but Cecilia knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let fear stand in her way. She had chosen to do the right thing, and now she would face whatever came next with courage and integrity. Chapter 5: A New Beginning. The following weeks at the office were filled with uncertainty. The investigation into the financial discrepancies Cecilia had uncovered was underway, and the company was in turmoil. There were meetings with external auditors, internal investigations, and a growing sense of unease that hung over the entire organization like a dark cloud. For Cecilia, it felt like her life had been turned upside down. She had done the right thing by exposing the fraud, but now she had to face the consequences. She knew that if the investigation was successful, Jason, and possibly others, would be held accountable, but Cecilia wasn't sure what would happen to her in the process. Would she lose her job? Her career? She had already paid a heavy price for her integrity, and there was no way to know if it would be enough. Every day, she watched the storm unfold from the sidelines. The whispers around the office grew louder as employees speculated about the investigation's outcome. Some feared the company might not survive the scandal, and others, including those who had once distanced themselves from her, began to seek her out, asking for details. It felt strange to have people approach her now, after weeks of silence. They had avoided her when she had stood firm against Jason's proposal, but now, in the face of a crisis, they seemed to want to be on the right side of things. Despite the mounting pressure, Cecilia remained focused on her work. She continued to perform her duties with the same diligence and attention to detail that she always had, though she had to admit that the stress was beginning to wear her down. She knew the investigation was taking its toll on everyone, but she couldn't afford to let it distract her. She had chosen the path of integrity, and now she had to stick with it, no matter what came next. Finally, one morning, Cecilia received the call she had been dreading and yet hoping for. It was from Mr. Edwards, the company director. "Good morning, Cecilia," Mr. Edwards greeted her. "I wanted to let you know that the investigation has concluded, and we have the results." "And?" Cecilia asked, her voice tight with anxiety. She braced herself for the worst. "We've confirmed the fraud. Jason and 2 other executives were involved in embezzling funds from the company." For a moment, Cecilia didn't know how to react. The confirmation of her suspicions hit her like a punch to the gut, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. The truth had come to light, and now, the company could begin to recover from the damage that had been done. As a result of the investigation, Jason and the other executives have been terminated from their positions, Mr. Edwards continued. "We're working with law enforcement to ensure that they are held accountable for their actions." "Thank you for letting me know, Mr. Edwards," Cecilia said, her voice trembling slightly. The weight of the situation still hung heavily on her shoulders, but she felt a sense of vindication. She had done the right thing, and now it was time for justice to be served. "There's one more thing I'd like to discuss with you," Mr. Edwards added. "You've shown exceptional integrity throughout this entire ordeal, Cecilia. Your actions have not only saved the company from significant financial loss, but they've also helped us restore our reputation. As a result, we'd like to offer you the position of Chief Financial Officer." "What?" Cecilia gasped, her mind racing. "I don't." She couldn't even finish her sentence. The offer was completely unexpected, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. "I understand this might come as a surprise," Mr. Edwards said. "But your honesty, your dedication, and your refusal to compromise your values have earned you the respect of everyone here. We need someone like you to lead the financial department and help restore confidence in the company. We believe you're the right person for the job."
I don't know what to say," Cecilia replied, her voice barely above a whisper.
She had always believed that doing the right thing was its own reward, But this offer was beyond anything she had ever imagined. She had spent years building her career based on hard work and integrity, but she had never expected this level of recognition. "You don't have to say anything just yet," Mr. Edwards said. "Take some time to think about it. But we would be honored if you would accept the offer." "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," Cecilia said, still in shock. "I'll give it some thought. But thank you for your trust in me." As she hung up the phone, Cecilia sat in stunned silence. The weight of the past few weeks seemed to lift from her shoulders all at once, but she was still processing the news. Chief Financial Officer. It was a dream come true. But more than that, it was a confirmation of everything she had stood for. Her integrity had been tested, and now it had been rewarded in the most unexpected way. In the days that followed, Cecilia accepted the offer. She was humbled, grateful, and yet, still uncertain about the road ahead. She knew that her new position would come with its own set of challenges, but she was ready to face them. The company needed leadership, and Cecilia was determined to lead with the same principles that had guided her for the past 15 years. On her first day as Chief Financial Officer, Cecilia walked into the office with a sense of quiet pride. Her colleagues, who had once avoided her, now greeted her with genuine respect. Some even offered apologies for their earlier behavior, acknowledging the courage it had taken to stand up to Jason. But Cecilia accepted these gestures with grace. She had nothing to prove anymore. She had always known who she was and what she stood for. As she sat down in her new office, Cecilia looked out the window, her thoughts turning to the lessons she had learned along the way. True success, she realized, was not measured by titles or salaries, but by the strength of character and the courage to do what was right, even when it seemed like the hardest thing to do. And as the day wore on, Cecilia knew that she had made the right choice. She had chosen integrity, and in the end, it had been worth everything.
If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us and motivates us to continue sharing heartwarming, inspiring stories almost every day.